Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about westward expansion, and today we are going to talk about something College Board likes to call the New South. So if you are ready, let's begin. All right, so let's define what the New South is. And the New South is the idea that after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, that the South should try to change their economy, that they should try to industrialize, they should try to get more factories, okay? They should try to be more like the North. And there are some Southern leaders who want this to happen. One in particular is this guy you see pictured on the right, Henry Grady. He's the editor of the Atlantic Constitution and newspaper, and he's trying to push for people to try to think about the reasons why the South struggled in the Civil War or the problems with the Southern economy being so agriculture focused, that the South needs to have more industry. They need to have more factories. Why doesn't the South have their own textile factories? Why don't they make their own clothing in the South? Why ship all the cotton to the North to make the clothing, right? So the South should be more like the North. They should use factories to try to industrialize their economy. Now, that's the idea. However, it is important to note that sharecropping, tenant farming is still common. Remember, sharecropping is when poor people, African Americans, and poor whites, this is after slavery, but they would have to lease the land from the big plantation owners, big farm owners, and they would have to pay a share of their crops to have right to have the land, right? So this is sharecropping is what comes in the economy in the South after the Civil War. So there's this battle between the old way of doing things with agriculture in the South versus the new South of trying to industrialize, okay? Okay, so with the New South and the idea of what's going on in the South, one really important idea, and we've talked about this before, but it's so important that we're talking about it again, okay, is the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, so this is a Supreme Court case that upholds racial segregation, and it marks the end of most of the political gains that African Americans made during Reconstruction. Okay, so this Supreme Court case basically establishes the idea of separate but equal. And that phrase is a key phrase that you got to memorize, put it in your heads. And it basically says that the state is allowed to have separate facilities for people of color and for people who are white, as long as they are quote unquote equal. And what equal meant was up for debate, right? So if the fact that there are two schools, well, it's equal, right? Even if one school might be better than another, well, there's still school for each group of people, okay? So this Plessy versus Ferguson is going to mean that there's going to be Jim Crow laws, which are laws that promote segregation in the South. There's going to be increased violence, discrimination. There's going to be a lot of issues that come about because of this, okay? Now, we do need to remember that this does get overturned by another Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Ed, but that takes another 50, 60 years for that to happen. So Plessy v. Ferguson is the law of the land for a long time, and it basically, like we said, separate but equal, upholds segregation. Okay, this is actually the last big slide for today. It's short notes today. So we got to think about the New South. There's some issues. They're trying to industrialize, but there's still some issues with African American rights. What are some African American reformers, people trying to kind of change the way things are, fight for equality? Okay, one person really important to know, her name is Ida B. Wells, and you can see her pictured here on the top right. And she fought for political and social equality. She was a journalist. She was an outspoken critic of something called lynching. And lynching is where it was mostly in the South, but basically where mobs of people would find somebody, usually an African American, that did something wrong, did some injustice, real or perceived, and it's kind of mob justice. They would hang the person, and it was a big issue in the South. And it wasn't like there was a trial being held and then this was the punishment. It was kind of mob justice in the moment. And she was a big outspoken critic of lynching, and she tried to get there to be an anti-lynching law across the whole nation. Okay, so she's one really important person to know. You could use her for evidence about how African Americans are trying to reform society after Reconstruction. And another really important person to know is on the bottom right here, Booker T. Washington, and he advocates for something called vocational training. Now, if you've never heard of that before, what that means is job training. So Booker T. Washington has this theory that African Americans should not expect or demand immediate equality. And that African Americans' path to equality actually needs to be done through jobs and through an economic equality, right? So he tries to create schools for African Americans to go to be trained in different jobs and careers. And the idea is that once they get more economic equality, then they can demand the social equality that they will get. So Booker T. Washington has this idea again of vocational training is that's a way to fight discrimination as opposed to just immediate equality demands. Okay. Now, on the bottom, this isn't really a reform, but it's something that's kind of important to know is that there are people out there in America and all around the world at this time trying to come up with scientific theories of race. And so there are some anthropologists, which is a group of scientists that basically study humans, that are trying to argue that African Americans are scientifically inferior to whites. And they use some pseudoscience like skull measurements to try to prove this. Obviously this is all debunked now and it's not true, but these were some justifications for people in this time for why it was okay to treat African Americans as less, using Jim Crow laws, segregation, that kind of stuff. Okay. All right, that's it. These were really short. This was quick, but it is important. So that's the notes for the New South. Let's think about our big ideas. What was a goal and what was the reality of the New South? What did Plessy versus Ferguson state? What's that key phrase? And then describe the work of the African American reformers. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.